Welcome to The Pursuit of Health, the podcast on health policy for a free and modern society. Well, welcome everyone to another episode of The Pursuit of Health. I'm your host, Rainier Schur. Joining me again today is Jared Rhoads and Colleen Smith. Welcome.
Thank you.
So today we're going to do something slightly different. The last few episodes we've been discussing some of our articles. But for this episode, we're going to dive into the realm of action. So Jared has had the opportunity to testify in favor of a bill in Vermont to make it easier for foreign trained doctors to practice medicine in Vermont. And I think that's an interesting topic for our audience, not only because it's focused on specific reforms, but it's giving us some insight into the workings of what it means to reform healthcare on the state level. And so, Jared, before we get into the bill itself, what's it like getting involved in health policy reform on the state level? Like, I think a lot of the people might assume that you need to have all these connections and it's hard to get in, but what's the actual experience like?
I think it's fun. For me, it's a nice complement to the other kind of work that we do. You know, we're researching and writing things, and as you said, this is like the realm of action kind of. I enjoy, getting out and getting into those the state houses and the Capitol buildings and having good conversations with new people. You're going to meet new people during this kind of process, members of the committee that you don't know, other people who are testifying. You get to have some interesting connections and make new connections with people like that, and you'll learn a lot. So it's a fun and I think kind of it's expansive experience. And let's see, in Vermont now, I've done this in a number of states over the years, but this was the first time that I've done any kind of testimony on a Vermont bill. So that's up in Montpelier, Vermont, is the capital, and got to meet the members of the Health and Welfare Committee. That's the committee that is handling this particular bill, and there's a number of other people who, like I said, testified that day that I got to converse with. So that's a tiny bit about the process. You're right. Like you don't need incoming connections. You can go into one of these hearings and testify as any member of the any citizen, member of the community. You don't even need to be from that state, right? So, I personally, I live in New Hampshire, but I'm very close, obviously, to Vermont, and we're monitoring lots of different states and what bills are coming up. And so, you don't have to be from Vermont to, from the state that you're going to get involved. The other thing I'll say is that they're also generally very interested to hear new voices. They want to hear from people that they have never met before. There are some sort of regular old people who go to lots of these, and it's their job, and they're doing it on for practically every bill, right? They're like, but maybe they're actual registered lobbyists, or they just work in those fields, and they show up for every bill. We're much more selective, of course, in what we get involved with. We don't have the time to get involved in absolutely every bill. But yeah, they're interested to hear from new people, and for them to hear from some new perspectives.
Yeah, what I found interesting about watching your testimony, and I've also seen it in other scenarios where there's an opportunity to testify on a bill, is that there's a section for public comment, and very often the kind of organizations that haven't been invited to give comment use that as an opportunity to speak on a specific bill. And so like for me that was quite surprising because I always thought that, oh, like you have to be invited and it's like this very formal process, but really just anyone can speak at those moments, and that's really an opportunity for us as a smaller and growing organization to just show up and speak. And from what I could tell, they were very happy with your comments. So let's get into those comments, and maybe before doing that, we can set the wider context for the bill. Where's this bill coming from? What's the kind of wider context for why this bill was being proposed?
Yeah, so I'll sort of uh, sketch out how some of this works, and actually this might be a great time for Colleen. You can get involved too because I know you know how licensing works and everything and all that context. Yeah, I think a couple of key pieces for listeners to know who maybe don't follow these details closely. I mean, first of all, medical licensing, right? Like, how do we produce practicing physicians in this country? Um, there's obviously medical school, right? But when you graduate from medical school, you've got the MD, you've got the degree, but that's not the same as being licensed. Like, you can't immediately go out and just independently get a job as a physician or hang your own shingle as a physician in practice. There's more to it after that. And there's a million details, but the one thing that I would point to that's critical in understanding this issue is the postgraduate residency, which is a multi-year commitment of additional like postgraduate training. So you've graduated medical school, but you still need a couple more years, and these experiences can be as short as like 2 years. They can be much longer. It's very dependent on the state. It's dependent on the specialty that you're dealing with. A lot of variation in there, but let's call it at least a couple years of additional training that every physician is required to do before they can then go ahead and get licensed in a state. And a quick reminder there, that all medical licensing in the United States is done state by state. It's not a federal thing. So you don't get licensed to practice medicine by the U.S. federal government and then have the ability to practice absolutely anywhere. Instead, you go through the various steps and then you get licensed in a particular state. And you can be licensed in multiple states, but you're going to start somewhere, right? And so you start with one state and then get licensed there to practice. Okay, so that's all sort of background. Now the part where this bill comes in is the sort of the fact that in most states, if you are somebody who is a physician that was trained elsewhere, so out of the United States, some other country, um, the only exception being Canada, but let's say you went to medical school in France and you did all your training there, and you've even been a physician, a practicing surgeon there for 10 years. If you, for whatever reason, you want to come to the United States and practice medicine here, in most states, you need to redo your your that residency training, that residency part, that multi-year sort of training component of this. And you don't have to go back to medical school. You don't have to repeat that, but you do have to do that postgraduate training. And that's a big lift. It's not just a little bit of paperwork. It's not just oh, you have to file a fee. I mean, we could talk about, those kinds of hassles and stuff separately, but it's a pretty big deal. It's a pretty big barrier. Um, and so this kind of bill that we're talking about with Vermont, Senate Bill 142, um, would eliminate that. It basically think of this as creating a pathway for a foreign trained physician to get licensed in the state of Vermont to practice medicine, um, without having to redo that residency. And there still are some requirements, right? But this bill would create a pathway that doesn't require that redo of that training.
Just to chime in here, I think, Jared, when you say that's a big lift, you significantly understate how big a lift it is. So I'll just add uh, residencies are actually at least 3 years. So 3 years is the shortest residency for any position. And what makes it such a big lift is not that it's like 3 years of working a normal job where you get paid like you would expect a doctor to be paid and you're working 40 hours a week or somewhere around that. It's you're working 80 hours a week on paper, but it's you often more like 100 hours a week. Um, you're getting paid less than minimum wage most of the time. And You basically are at the beck and call of all of the doctors who are kind of ahead of you on the totem pole. And sometimes, not always, it's getting better, but there's like some degree of kind of abuse and in the system that doctors are really working to kind of get rid of. That it's a major issue in the US, but it's a big ask to say to someone who has been a practicing surgeon in France, who, for just to take your example, for maybe 5 or 10 years, to come to the US and repeat a residency here. And a surgery residency is actually 6 years. So 6 years of getting paid less than minimum wage and working 100 hours a week when you're 55, you're already close to retirement, and you already have thousands of surgeries under your belt, is just it's more than prohibitive. It's really just not something that most people would be willing to do.
Yeah, I think that to like concretize it, like you'd have to imagine what that would look like in other industries, like someone who's highly trained in a particular craft or a particular profession, like a pilot or something, or an engineer. If you would move, you would just do like some basic tests to like make sure you're up to scrap and like not make you like redo everything from the start. And yeah, it is very prohibitive, and like, and we can talk about other elements of residency that are problematic in themselves. Like there's like the whole matching program where you apply for programs, and basically where they tell you to go is where you go. And like just imagine doing that. Like you might live in like New England, and you apply for residency through the match, and like you end up on the West Coast or down in the South. And like if you have a family, well, that's very difficult. So there's just so much that would be a barrier to doctors that are completely fully trained and capable to offer high quality healthcare from essentially starting over.
Yeah, and if you're wondering, like, well, how does this come about? Like, why does this persist, et cetera? I mean, I think one thing to look at here is just this is a form of protectionism, right? I mean, if it, I mean, all of licensing kind of is like that. But even just setting aside like the bigger battle about licensing for another day, even if we're just focusing on like this component of the whole licensing process, it's yet another barrier to keep out competition, right? And so there's kind of no surprise that in general the state boards of medicine, who are in some sense representing physicians, are the already licensed physicians. Those would be the incumbents in this example. That what are the new foreign trained physicians who would like to practice? Well, their competition. That's what they represent to the existing physicians. And so, you know, uh, it's a classic kind of erecting a barrier to entry. So it's a little bit of a protection, a little bit of a protection from competition that would potentially lower compensation, et cetera. So that's part of it as well, I think.
And this is kind of ironic in the setting of the entire medical community is a little bit, the word up in arms is not right, but um, kind of facing this real, all of these reports of shortages of doctors in a variety of specialties. There are arguments that I'm seeing going on like X sometimes about like doctors shouldn't have to work without sleep, but the reality is that there aren't enough doctors in certain fields for them to to like have a situation in which they don't have to work sometimes without sleep. And yet there's this like great deal of protectionism in the profession, of not wanting to bring in people from outside, quote unquote outsiders. And I think there's some real, one of the major criticisms of bringing people in from other countries is that it's hard to ensure that these doctors have had training or experience that is, adequate, that is equivalent to what we provide in the US. And I do think that the training that doctors get in the US is really high quality for the most part. But there are answers to a lot of these to a lot of these criticisms, and I think it's a little bit dishonest not to recognize that.
Right. I think it's also worth noting that America is like a little bit unique in this compared to other countries. Like in other countries, it's actually much easier to move between countries if you're trained in one. Now, some of that has to do with history. Like if you train in the UK, it's very easy to go to any other country that it's part of the British Commonwealth. So then it's easier to move to Australia, New Zealand, uh, and whatnot. But there's no reason why America needs to be one of the most difficult countries to move to practice medicine. And yeah, then you come up with like these kind of embarrassing stories of surgeons from Syria or Russia or India that move to America and like they end up like driving Uber, right? Uh, and that doesn't only matter for them, but for many Americans, right? Like they're struggling to access care because there are not enough doctors. So why is it that we can't make it easier for these foreign trained doctors to go, go through a process which shows that they are competent, but without having to go through like a 3 to 6 year residency and upend their life and get paid way less than what their actual potential is worth?
You might even say that, okay, so the examples Ray just used, Syria, Russia, maybe their medical schools there aren't as good. Maybe. Although, to be fair, we bring in medical students from those countries. So, people who have graduated from medical school in those countries with an MD and put them through residency in the United States. So, there's been already an assessment of what medical schools abroad are equivalent to our medical schools in the US to such a degree that those graduating medical students can perform appropriately in our residencies in the US. So we have that already in place and it is from those countries. But even if you were to say, okay, but I wouldn't trust a doctor from India or a doctor from Russia to have had a good residency, the same thing applies to doctors from Europe, from the UK, from Australia, who have trained in those countries as well. And I think you would be really hard pressed to say that their system is not as good as ours.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to mention some of the harms of this, to point out that there really are harms and inefficiencies here. I mean, first of all, it's just what a waste of human capital in some sense to have this like fully trained, well-trained physician someplace else who wants to come here and practice, and they are nothing against Uber drivers, but they're underemployed in some fashion, right? They've got some maybe a gig economy job or something like that. Just making there are actually a number of people who will come over and find something that's like somewhat health related, but it's still a real underemployment. A lot of times they'll end up working as like a phlebotomist or something like that. Well, if you're a surgeon, stepping to a phlebotomy role, that's a big a big resource there if thinking about of it that way for a moment. It's also massively, I think, insulting and harmful to the individual person, right? Let's not forget about them. But and then if you want to think about the American public who would have access to one more physician in the pipeline here, but doesn't, right? There's a harm there. You can think about the hospitals and the clinics and so on who would like to employ one of these people, but they can't for under the status quo. So there's harms all over the place, and so that's one of the reasons why I think it's exciting to get to work on a bill like this.
Well, let's just get into that then, Jared. Tell us a little bit more about the bill, about your testimony, about the arguments you were giving, the pushback, and also how you might end up testifying more on it in the future.
Yeah. So, I mean, the basics of the Vermont bill are that it would allow a foreign trained physician to uh, apply for a job where they are in a supervised role. So there actually there is like I mean, it's almost kind of like a residency component of it in the sense that you're supervised. I mean, it's different, but they would work for an employer in the state that has promised to like supervise their care and work with them and everything. And so for the folks that are concerned about quality and those kinds of things, there is I guess a check and a balance on that, right? So that would be part of it. This particular bill has a 2-year sort of provisional license for them to work under that in a health setting. It other some of the other details is that this foreign trained individual would still need to pass and show that they've passed the USMLE step 1 and 2. So that's the United States Medical Licensing Exam. That's the same in terms of the exam part of the process. That's the same standard as a U.S. trained physician. Um, and then afterwards, after this provisionary period, they would then be allowed to apply for a regular license. And that's, so there are still, for those people who are really concerned and maybe nervous about seeing somebody who's been trained and practicing elsewhere, there's still these sort of checks in it. And there are a couple of other details too. Like one other detail that I'll mention is that almost all states that have done this, and there are a handful of states, almost all states that have done this have some kind of like a recency requirement. So they'll say, okay, you're saying that you were a physician who was practicing in Germany, let's say. Okay, there's some recency requirement, usually something like you have to have been practicing for 3 out of the last 5 years, or 2 out of the last 7 years, or 4 out of the last 10, et cetera. A lot of states have set that parameter to different things. But it's almost all states have something like that, right? So it's again that's maybe a check on the idea that you couldn't have somebody who got, I suppose, trained, like 30 years ago and hasn't done anything in medicine during that whole time, and you could concoct a scenario that maybe would you'd be concerned about, but those once again just another check on that. And so, those kinds of details in the bill, in the committee design process, those are all the sorts of details that get hammered out, and some of the details that organizations like us we can weigh in on and give advice on or ideas about.
What about your testimony itself?
Yeah, I think one kind of organizing principle around the testimony that I put together, I sort of saw this as like, well, maybe a good opportunity to make like a kind of 3-part argument here. I was thinking of the first part as like the health argument. I mean, that's going to be very very front and center on people's mind, obviously in the Health and Welfare Committee. So, talked about how having more physicians, this is something that is like a supply side solution, right? And so having more physicians means access to greater access to care, right? Maybe shorter wait times, and you can cite some of those problems that Vermont has. A lot of places have that. You can link that to say, well, that could lead to better outcomes. So like if we're having better access to care. Vermont is a pretty rural state, and we all know rural communities in particular struggle with access problems in various forms, and so this kind of bill is something that can address that. There's also the economic part of this whole thing. I mentioned this a little bit before as sort of there is a kind of protectionism aspect to this, but we with greater competition, you could get some better prices, right? If you just think about supply and demand and how all that works. Also, just think about the from the economic perspective, just what a sort of we talk about the waste of like the human resource here, right? I mean, this highly trained people, and they're going to be underemployed if we don't offer them some sort of path to be able to practice. And then thirdly, I talked about kind of like the moral argument too. These people are people who have, demonstrated their ability and their interest in wanting to practice their profession. And it's both sort of a freedom related problem if we don't let them do that, as well as a freedom related problem if we don't let what about the Vermonters who like want to hire, who want this person as their physician? That's sort of a moral argument there as well. So I try to work in that as well. And I think that the committee they liked those three, kind of balanced aspects of it. Um, there are other testifiers and such who will, maybe focus on one or two of those, but sort of not kind of unite and integrate the three of them like that. Which so it's I thought it was a nice touch to approach it that way.
Yeah, I listened to the hearing online, and I did notice that the state senator that was chairing the hearing repeated your notion that like there's a health argument, there's an economic argument, and there's a moral argument, and she said that she liked that. And so, who knows? Maybe like when they continue debating this bill, like they'll like point to those three things, and then you've helped kind of like shape that.
Yeah, I put in the moral argument whenever I can, and I often do in this kind of testimony. It's now I will say, I mean, I wish we could just like kind of waltz into any committee hearing and kind of make just a straight up philosophical argument that focuses on the moral stuff, and that would just everybody would just put down their opposition, and that would just solve it all. In honesty, I think it's probably unrealistic to expect that. There's too many people from, with too many different, incoming ideas and that they hold and everything to expect that to happen so easily. So, but I think it really is important to work it in and to highlight it as an important thing. But a thing that's like, this like unified, these unified benefits. Along with the other components.
I mean, the state medical board, who's the major dissenter to this bill, from what I understand, didn't address the moral argument at all when they came back with their kind of statement of issues that they had. It seems like their dissent to the bill was very much from a practical standpoint, and I'm not sure if that's because they kind of agree with the moral argument to some extent, or they don't feel capable of discussing the moral argument. I'm not really sure where that's coming from, but I think to me, it was interesting that their response was really just practically, who do you think is going to do all these things that you're saying need to be done? And a lot of things are already being done. But but I'm wondering, like, you also helped just kind of rebut some of their dissent, some of the state medical board's dissent. How did you go about doing that? And like, can you talk a little bit about that part of the process?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think you might be thinking of the argument like, well, won't the hospitals and all the clinics who are going to take on like the supervisory role in this, like, won't they want like funds? And then so don't we need to appropriate like millions of dollars and make that part of this bill? And then at that point, Vermont taxpayers might reasonably object and say, oh, well, we don't want, why are we responsible for like funding the hospitals to take on this thing? And that, something like that could scuttle the whole effort. And you're just one of the sort of things that I pointed out is saying, well, look, if, you have a willing hospital or clinic who wants to, take on the supervisory role, um, and you have a willing, foreign trained physician who wants to go through this process to become, to get the full license to practice. There are ways that just having them operate at a slight discount, honestly,
Yeah, pay them
for
less.
Yeah, pay them slightly less, right? Like it, and it doesn't need to be, clearly if they're trained at a level that is like beyond like what a original residency would be, right? Like so, it doesn't have to be the sort of like low pay that you were talking about earlier. It could be just like a regular physician, but at a slight discount, right? Okay, so if
Yeah,
you're going to argue
10%,
that
20%, right.
totally, yeah, yeah, exactly. If you're going to say that, having this person on board kind of, it saps, a tiny bit of productivity from this other person who has to like look over the shoulder or check things once a week, at the end of the week or to check notes on certain cases or something like that. Okay, I get it, but that doesn't need to be some like fund that then has to come from the taxpayer or something like that. The, an applying foreign physician would be happy to work at for exactly a 10-20% discount. It's still going to be way better than their alternatives of being like hugely underemployed.
Yeah.
Working as a barista or a gig economy kind of person or something like that. So yeah, that was an example of one of the things that's come up.
I also, this bill to me is a little bit pro-immigration, which I think is kind of an interesting bill to come out in the current political climate. Uh, like, to what degree did that factor into your decision to support it and to go to the Vermont Assembly and discuss the bill?
Yeah, it is pro-immigrant, and so I'm happy to. Yeah, I'm pro-immigrant, so yeah, no problem there, no tension or conflict there. I do think I've noticed, in reaching back a few years in the past, I think there's been some interest in there was originally some interest in these kinds of bills among Republicans, but actually in the past couple of years, let's say the last like 2 years, I've noticed that it's tended to be more Democrats that are proposing these bills and sponsoring them and so I think in general, I would definitely say that this is a bipartisan kind of idea. It's not, of all the health policy ideas that we could be, pushing, this is not the one that like clearly aligns with one or the other, one party or the other. Um, for a lot of reasons, it can be, if you're talking about sort of like reasonable centrists and, from each party, I think it has a lot of bipartisan feel to it. But there is a little bit of a trend, I would say. I mean, certainly in Vermont and New Hampshire, the two places where I'm sort of doing some activity on this, those are both sponsored by Democrats. It's just how it is at the moment, I guess. There's always shifting policy windows and windows of opportunity, and certain things come in and out of favor. I don't know, maybe that would switch, but just with everything going on in immigration at the federal level and the ICE situation, everything, I think Republicans have struggled with knowing whether to get involved in this or not. It sort of depends on what kind of Republican there are. There's so many different factions of Republicans if you think about that party. And it just happens to be at the moment that this is sort of I guess more of maybe a Democrat aligned issue, but like I said, that changes, that changes and shifts.
Hmm.
What I also find interesting about this bill and your testimony on it, Jared, is that I think it's a very good example of a way that you can be principled in healthcare reform that moves the system towards more freedom while still kind of acknowledging the political constraints that you're operating in, right? Because like the long-term like ideal would be something like state medical boards don't hold a monopoly on licensure and that like you have multiple organizations that offer it and it's a voluntary thing that they figure out with the hospitals and different people that need their physicians to show that they're competent and whatnot. But it takes a lot of work to get there and you're not going to change the system by barging into like a hearing and be like we need to abolish the monopoly on state licensure. um and if we were in a world of that kind of ideal, then the bill that you're testifying on would like take freedom away, right? Like if it's something that doctors and licensing organizations have figured out to do on their own, and then to say like, well, no, like we want to impose these rules that people have to like have the supervisory process, like that would be a move away from freedom. But within the current context, it's definitely a move towards more freedom because you're creating some space for essentially the entity that wants to hire the foreign trained physician to come up with their own system for getting them to practice independently after that whole process without the state medical boards essentially vetoing them. And you can do that from a principled perspective. Like in that's definitely one thing that I like about this bill and your testimony on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, and thank you, and I agree. The Yeah, this is exactly the kind of thing where you could talk about like an ideal that's actually different and even better and everything, but it's not where people are at the moment. That's the whole Overton window kind of idea. Um, and so, but you can still totally see this as a good move forward, right? And it's not about it's not so much this isn't like we got to be pragmatic or something like that. It's no, you got to be strategic, and you have to know like where things are in the moment and like what can you actually accomplish. I mean, there's a good chance that this is going to pass in this state, and so when you're at the end of that, things will be better than they were before. And so and you haven't like cut off future options and stuff like that. Like you can if things change and evolve in such a way that like you actually can have a deeper medical licensing debate sometime down the road. Like you haven't prevented that from happening or anything like that. There are some other issues that where that might be the case and where it is like a hard decision to know what's the right thing to do. Is it to get involved in, is it to support this or not? Like sometimes when there are the one that comes to mind for me is like midwifery licensing. Okay, sometimes you have like a profession where there is no licensing, and if you ask the people and you'd like them to be able to practice that profession, but because of the lack of a license, it's actually hard because there's like a policy gray area, right? It like hasn't been addressed, and then some of the people who like let's say in the midwifery case, like they want to they want to invent a license for it, and then you're sort of asking yourself, well, is that better or not? If we create a license, does that help the situation from a rights perspective and or not? And that those can be trickier. I think this one is clearer that this one is very very good. And so I'm happy to be working on it.
Yeah, and I think that points not only for the need of uh, principles, but uh, kind of human intelligence of like what's going on in the state. And if you think that, well, if I ask for there to be a license for midwives, are there enough people in the states that when the time is right, we can move towards general licensing reform that could apply to everywhere? And a
Right.
principal isn't going to necessarily tell you that. The principal will tell you what the principal thing to do is, but it won't tell you the facts on the ground that you would also need as input to see long term where you could potentially move the conversation.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And yeah, maybe the one takeaway here is that like good policy work that like we're all trying to do. You can't do it from an armchair. It's a contact sport at times. You got to get out there and be in the real world. People living their lives on Twitter or something probably are you're not going to be attuned to like the actual reality of some of these issues. And so yeah, we're putting the effort in to actually you know be effective, and so that's what we're trying to do here.
Well, Jared, thanks for sharing your story with this effort, and we might return to it in the future if we win the case and there's a reason to speak on it. And yeah, hopefully we'll be testifying in more state assemblies, and we'll see. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
To stay up to date, subscribe to our show from whatever podcast platform you're listening from. To support our show and the Center for Modern Health, you can make a tax-deductible donation at centerformodernhealth.org/support. Thank you for listening.